Combat medics, they said, were just glorified nurses with better camouflage. They knew how to wrap a bandage and hand out painkillers, but they couldn't carry the real weight of war. The mocking words echoed in the dry, oppressive air of the outpost, a constant, low hum beneath the whine of generators and the distant crump of artillery practice. They clung to the canvas tents and settled in the dust like a fine, bitter powder. And no one felt their weight more than Lieutenant Alara Vance. At 27, she was a whisper in a world of shouts. She stood barely 5 feet and 2 inches, a figure of quiet efficiency lost among the towering frames of the Marines she served. Her uniform, devoid of the flashy insignia that declared others' prowess, hung on her small frame. Her face, often smudged with dirt and sweat, looked too young for the weary lines already forming around her sharp, observant eyes. Her brown hair was always pulled back in a severe, functional bun, no stray strands permitted. There was a subtle beauty to her, the kind that didn't demand attention and therefore rarely received it. To her comrades, she was a ghost in the machine of war. They saw her, but they didn't see her. She was the medic, the one you went to for a sprained ankle or a nasty cut, the dispenser of antibiotics and ibuprofen. She was a necessary function, not a fellow warrior, not someone who belonged in the thick of it. They'd watch her cross the dusty expanse of the base, her medbag almost too large for her body slung over her shoulder, and the smirks would follow. "Nurse," they'd mutter, the word twisted into an insult. Alara never corrected them. She never raised her voice, but her gaze, steady and unnervingly perceptive, caught every word, every sneer, and filed it away in the quiet, fortified chambers of her mind. Before the day the sky fell, before 200 steps of stone became a legend, she was just a shadow, moving through the periphery of their world. The sun beat down on Firebase Chimera with a merciless, white-hot intensity. It was a place carved out of rock and dust, a testament to human stubbornness in a land that wanted nothing to do with it. The heart of the base, and its greatest challenge, was the stone staircase. It wasn't an official name, but it was the only one that mattered. 200 uneven, hand-carved stone steps snaked their way up the sheer face of the hillside to the main defensive bunker, a fortress of last resort. The staircase was a beast, a vertical monster that left even the fittest Marines gasping for air. In times of peace, it was a training tool, a subject of dares and grim jokes. In times of war, it was a lifeline. Alara knew those steps intimately. She climbed them twice a day to check on the sentries in the bunker, her medbag bouncing against her hip, her breathing controlled, and even when her legs screamed in protest. She never complained, never made a show of the effort. But her movements were quick, deliberate, imbued with a readiness that made a few of the older, more experienced soldiers pause and watch. Not that they would ever admit it. This afternoon, the heat was a physical presence, shimmering in waves above the concrete. Alara was in the small aid station, a concrete box that perpetually smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee, methodically restocking supplies. Her hands moved with a practiced grace, counting gauze pads, checking the seals on IV bags. The methodical task was a small island of order in a sea of potential chaos. The illusion of peace was shattered by the swaggering entrance of Sergeant Cade Rollins and his cronies. Rollins was a man built of loud noises and brute confidence, with a jaw like a cinder block and a grin that was all sharp edges. He leaned against the doorframe, his bulk blocking the meager light. "Hey, Vance," he called out, his voice booming in the small space, ensuring everyone within earshot heard him. "Ever lift anything heavier than that glorified purse of yours?" A chorus of gruff laughter followed. Alara didn't look up. She continued her count, her fingers tracing the edge of a suture kit. 17, 18. Rollins, unaccustomed to being ignored, pushed harder. "I'm serious. Bet if we tossed you a real load, a rucksack with actual gear, you'd crumple like a tin can." Another soldier, a corporal named Finch, with a perpetually bored expression, chimed in. "Give her a break, Cade. She's too delicate for that. Stick to your little nurse kit, Lieutenant." For a single fractional moment, Alara's fingers paused over a roll of tape. The silence stretched, thin and taut. Then, she picked it up and placed it on the shelf. She didn't offer a retort. She didn't acknowledge their presence. To them, her silence was weakness, an admission of the truth in their words. But for Alara, it was armor. Words were wind. Action was stone. She had learned long ago that arguing with an echo was a fool's errand. They had already decided who she was. Her job was simply to be ready for the moment they were proven wrong. The quiet disdain wasn't confined to casual taunts in the supply station. It was a pervasive culture, a poison that had seeped into the very foundations of the base. It was in the mess hall, where the clatter of trays and the boisterous talk of soldiers created a wall of sound that seemed to exclude her. Days earlier, Elara had been standing off to the side, stirring a cup of lukewarm coffee, when Lieutenant Decker spotted her. Decker was young, ambitious, and carried his rank with an unearned air of authority. He nudged the man next to him, a private with a loud, braying laugh. "Look at Vance," Decker said, his voice carrying easily across the room. "Standing there like she's waiting for a city bus, not a firefight. What's she gonna do when things get real? Offer the enemy an aspirin?" The table erupted in laughter. Heads turned. Dozens of eyes fixed on her, some mocking, some merely curious. Elara took one final, slow stir of her coffee, the plastic spoon scraping against the bottom of the styrofoam cup. She set it down on the condiment counter, untouched, and walked out, her boots making soft, even sounds on the linoleum floor. The laughter followed her out the door, but the most defining moment, the one that would later be recalled with a burning, collective shame, came from Gunnery Sergeant Brock Jensen. Jensen was a mountain of a man, a decorated veteran whose physical strength was the stuff of base legend. He saw strength only in its most obvious form: muscle, volume, and aggression. He saw none of that in Elara Vance. He found her one sweltering afternoon near the base of the stone staircase, where she was instructing a new private on how to treat heat exhaustion. Jensen and his squad were lounging nearby, taking a break. He listened for a moment before letting out a dismissive snort. "Teaching him how to hand out water bottles, Vance? Important work." Elara met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Dehydration can be a killer, Gunny." Jensen laughed, a deep, rumbling sound. He stood up, stretching to his full, imposing height, and gestured with a thumb toward the looming staircase. The other Marines watched, sensing a spectacle. "You know, we all joke about these stairs," Jensen declared, his voice projecting for all to hear. "But I'll make you a promise right now. If you," he pointed a thick finger directly at Elara, "can haul a full-grown, combat-loaded man up all 200 of those steps, I will kneel right here in this dirt and I will call you chief for the rest of my tour." The proposal hung in the hot, still air. It was an impossible challenge, a public humiliation disguised as a joke. Cade Rollins and the others roared with laughter, slapping each other on the back. It was the perfect encapsulation of what they thought of her, a task so far beyond her perceived abilities that it was laughable. Elara simply looked at him, then at the staircase disappearing into the blinding sky. She held his gaze for a long moment. "Be careful what you promise, Gunnery Sergeant," she said, her voice quiet but carrying a strange, low frequency of warning. The laughter faltered for a second, caught off guard by her directness, but they recovered quickly, brushing it off as they waved her away. She was nothing, a small, quiet medic making an empty threat. As Elara turned and walked away, the weight of their condescension felt heavier than any rucksack. She found solace in a faded memory. Her father, a wiry, tough-as-nails rancher, teaching her to mend a fence in the driving rain. "Strength isn't in the noise you make, Elara," he told her, his hands sure and steady. "It's in the silence you keep while moving forward, one post at a time." The attack came without warning, ripping the monotonous afternoon to shreds. It started with a single, deafening explosion that shook the ground, followed instantly by the chaotic, high-pitched chatter of automatic gunfire. The air, once thick with heat, was now thick with cordite and fear. Alarms blared across Firebase Chimera, a frantic, shrieking sound that sent soldiers scrambling for cover. Elara was in the aid station when the first bullets tore through the thin metal wall, punching neat, deadly holes just above her head. She dropped to the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her hands were already moving with an instinct that bypassed thought. She grabbed her med bag, the familiar weight, a steadying presence in the chaos. Outside, the world had descended into hell. She could hear screams, sharp, terrified cries, mingling with barked orders over the crackle of radios. A mortar round landed with a sickening whump nearby, showering the area with dirt and shrapnel. Peering through the doorway, She saw the source of the ambush, enemy fighters positioned in the rocky outcrops overlooking the base, pouring relentless fire down on the exposed yard. Then she heard a name shouted over the radio, a voice choked with panic. "Maddox is down. I repeat, Maddox is hit at the base of the stairs. Private First Class Reese Maddox." A big, friendly Marine from Ohio, well over 200 pounds of solid muscle, who had once sheepishly asked her to look at a blister on his heel. Alara's mind snapped into focus. The base of the stairs was the most vulnerable position on the entire base, a kill zone with no viable cover. Without a second thought, she sprinted out of the aid station. The air exploded around her. Bullets kicked up spurts of dust at her feet, and the shriek of incoming rounds was a constant scream in her ears. She ran low and fast, her small frame making a difficult target. She found him crumpled at the foot of the first stone step. He was on his back, his eyes wide with shock, a dark, pulsing stain spreading rapidly across his chest. He was dying. Alara dropped to her knees beside him, her training taking over completely. Her hands ripped open his flak jacket and shirt, revealing a sucking chest wound. Blood coated her fingers, warm and slick. Before she could even apply a seal, a voice cut through the din. "Vance, what in God's name are you doing? Get back here." It was Lieutenant Decker, shouting from the relative safety of a concrete barrier a few yards away. His face was pale with fear, but his eyes were narrow with indignation. "That's a kill zone. You're out of your depth. Get back to the aid station where you belong." A few soldiers nearby, pinned down by the gunfire, nodded in agreement. "He's right, Lieutenant. You're gonna get yourself shot," one of them muttered. Ilara's hands didn't stop. She pressed a chest seal over the wound, her fingers sure and steady despite the chaos. She looked up, her eyes locking onto the soldier who had spoken. "Get me covering fire," she snapped, her voice a whip crack of authority that made him flinch. It wasn't a request, it was a command. Decker shook his head in disgust, turning away as if she were a lost cause. She didn't care. She had work to do. She had a life to save. Maddox was fading, his breathing shallow. The only path to survival was up the 200 steps to the bunker where the main surgical team was located. Moving him across the open yard was suicide. The stairs were the only way. She looped Maddox's heavy arm over her shoulder, her small frame bending under his weight. She ignored the shouts of disbelief from the soldiers around her. "She's insane," one of them yelled. "No one can drag him up those stairs. Leave him." Alara gritted her teeth, the dust and sweat stinging her eyes. She looked at the first step, then up at the seemingly infinite staircase disappearing into the smoke-filled sky. "No," she said, her voice cutting through the noise, a promise made to the dying man beside her and to the silent, watchful ghosts of her own conviction. "He will live." She took a deep breath, braced herself against the crushing weight, and took the first step. The first step was agony. The entire weight of Reese Maddox, a man who outweighed her by 100 pounds, his body limp and unhelpful, crashed down on her frame. Her knees buckled, and for a terrifying second, she thought they would both go down, but she locked her legs, her muscles screaming, and stabilized. The staircase loomed above her, a jagged spine of stone against a sky streaked with smoke. Maddox's blood was already soaking through her uniform, a hot, heavy weight on her back. Bullets whizzed past, chipping stone from the steps just inches from her head. The soldiers below watched, their firefight momentarily forgotten, their faces a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. "She's crazy!" Parker, a wiry kid from Texas, yelled over the gunfire. "They'll both die." Sergeant Malone, a grizzled veteran with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, barked into his radio, "Medics treat wounds. Carter, they don't play hero." The comment was laced with the bitter, sharp edge of accepted reality. Alara's jaw tightened until it ached. She took another step, then another. Her boots scraped against the stone, the sound lost in the cacophony of battle. By step 20, her breath was a ragged, tearing sound in her own ears. Her arms burned as if they were on fire. The shouts from below had become a meaningless roar. Her world had shrunk to the next step, the crushing weight on her shoulders, and the shallow, rasping breath of the man she refused to let die. Around step 50, the mockery began to curdle into disbelief. Cade Rollins stood behind a barricade, his rifle lowered slightly, his mouth half open. The smirk was gone, replaced by a look of stunned confusion. Even Lieutenant Decker was silent, his face a mask of conflict. At step 75, her foot slipped on a patch of loose gravel. She fell forward, her free hand scraping raw against the sharp edge of a step. Pain shot up her arm, blood trickled from her palm, mixing with the dust and Maddox's blood. She didn't stop. She used the wall of the hillside to push herself back up, dragging Maddox with her. His head lolled against her shoulder. "Hold on," she whispered, her voice a raw rasp. "I've got you. Just hold on." Her words were for him, but also for herself. At step 100, the halfway point, her legs gave out. She went down on one knee, the impact jarring her entire body. A gasp went through the soldiers watching below. This was it. This was the moment she failed, the moment their grim predictions came true. "Put him down, Vance!" a new voice bellowed through a loudspeaker. It was Captain Hayes, the company commander, a man known for his rigid adherence to protocol. "That's an order. You'll die before you reach the top." And Jenkins, the soldier who had once mockingly called her delicate, laughed, though it sounded strained now. 200 steps. She hasn't even made it halfway. The world was a swimming blur of pain and exhaustion. Alara's vision narrowed to a tunnel. Black spots danced at the edges. She bit her lip until she tasted blood. She thought of her father. "One post at a time, Alara." She thought of Jensen's arrogant promise. "I will call you chief." A flicker of fierce, defiant anger cut through the pain. She forced herself to her feet, her body trembling violently. She adjusted Maddox's weight, gripped him tighter, and kept climbing. From a safe distance, a tech specialist was piloting a recon drone. He focused the camera on the staircase, the feed displaying on his tablet. "Check this out," he said to the soldiers huddled around him. "She's putting on a hell of a show." They watched the tiny struggling figure on the screen, a real-life drama playing out in high definition. They were too far removed to feel the grit, to smell the blood, to comprehend the sheer force of will on display. The climb became a waking nightmare. Step 120. Step 135. Each one was a separate, monumental victory. Maddox stirred, his voice a faint, papery whisper against her ear. "Leave me." Something inside Alara snapped. The quiet, resilient medic was gone, replaced by a primal force. "Shut up," she growled, the voice low and ferocious, startling even herself. "I'm a combat medic. My job is to save lives, and you are not dying today." Tears of pain or gratitude, he didn't know which, rolled down Maddox's face. His hand, weak as it was, gripped her shoulder, holding on to her strength as if it were a lifeline. By step 150, the soldiers below were almost completely silent. The gunfire from the ambush had lessened as the enemy fighters, perhaps equally stunned by the spectacle, shifted their focus. The men of Firebase Chimera were no longer watching a medic they called Nurse. They were watching a titan in a small body perform an impossible feat. At step 170, a gust of wind carried the distant rumble of an engine. A supply convoy was arriving, a detail she would have noted with clinical detachment on any other day. But the sound triggered a memory, the low growl of her father's old pickup truck. "You don't quit, Alara. Not ever." The memory was a jolt of adrenaline. She blinked away the sting in her eyes and refocused on the final, agonizing stretch of stairs. Step 190. The bunker door was open, figures standing in the entrance, their faces etched with disbelief. 10 more steps. Her legs were numb, moving on memory alone. 9. Her lungs were on fire. 8. The world was tilting. 7. One post at a time. 6. 5. She could hear the shouts of encouragement now, a desperate, unified roar from the men below. 4, 3, 2, 1. Step 200. She stumbled across the threshold of the bunker, her body finally surrendering. She collapsed, her chest heaving, her mission complete. Maddox, still cradled in her arms, was immediately pulled away by waiting medics. Alara lay there, limp, her eyes fluttering closed, her hands still clutching a fistful of his bloody jacket. Her world went dark, just as the first whispers of her legend began to take root in the stunned silence below. As medics inside the bunker swarmed around Maddox, working furiously to stabilize him, a small, awestruck crowd gathered at the entrance, staring at Alara's crumpled form. Lieutenant Foster, a man who saw the world through the rigid lens of regulations, stepped forward, his perpetual frown etched deeper than usual. She was reckless, he announced, his voice loud enough to carry over the shocked whispers. Risking 2 lives for a grandstand play like that isn't heroism, it's a dereliction of protocol. A few soldiers nodded uneasily, his words providing a familiar framework to process an event that defied their understanding. Others remained silent, their eyes fixed on Alara as she was carefully lifted onto a stretcher. Her med bag, its strap torn, lay forgotten in the dirt by the bunker door. Spilling from an open pocket was a faded photograph of a smiling boy, with his leg in a cast, her younger brother, years ago. No one picked it up. They carried her inside, her face pale and slack, while Foster's judgment hung in the air like a stain. Below, the battle was effectively over. The remaining enemy fighters had retreated. The silence that descended upon the base was heavier and more profound than the preceding chaos. It was a silence filled with the weight of what they had just witnessed. Cade Rollins leaned against a concrete barrier, his rifle hanging limply from his hand. His face, usually a canvas of arrogance, was blank with shock. Gunnery Sergeant Brock Jensen stood alone, staring up at the empty staircase. It was just a set of stone steps, the same steps he'd mocked her about just that morning. Now they looked like an altar. He felt a cold, unfamiliar shame creeping up his spine. His challenge, made in jest and arrogance, had been met with a display of grit so profound it had shattered his narrow definition of strength. It was the private, Nolan Hayes, the quiet one who never joined in the jeering, who finally moved. He walked slowly to the base of the stairs, then began to climb. He moved with a sense of purpose, his eyes scanning the ground. When he reached the top, he saw the discarded medbag. He knelt, gently picked it up, and saw the photo. He carefully tucked it back inside a zippered pocket before slinging the bag over his own shoulder. It was a small act of reverence in a place that had just become sacred ground. Inside the bunker's aid station, the atmosphere was thick, with a mixture of professional urgency and personal awe. Insane, one of the medics muttered as he hooked Alara up to an IV drip. Absolutely insane. Was it worth it? An older medic, a woman named Harris, with tired, kind eyes, was checking Alara's pulse. She pushed herself past every conceivable limit, she said softly, looking at the small, still form on the cot. But Maddox is alive. You tell me if it was worth it. The whispers had already begun to snake their way through the base, carried over radios, and from soldier to soldier. She carried him all the way, all 200 steps, under fire. The men who had mocked her, Rollins, Decker, Jenkins, heard the words and fell silent, their eyes dropping to the ground. The air in Firebase Chimera had changed. Something had been broken, and something new, something more profound, had been forged in its place on those 200 steps of stone. Night fell, but few slept. The story of the climb was told and retold in hushed tones in the barracks and guard posts, each telling adding another layer to the burgeoning legend. Alara remained unconscious, her body fighting to recover from the monumental strain. Medic Harris and young Nolan Hayes, who had refused to leave the aid station, kept watch over her. Hayes had placed her medbag at the foot of her cot, a silent tribute. The next morning, the sun broke over the jagged mountains, casting long, stark shadows across the base. Alara stirred. A deep, bone-deep ache radiated through every muscle fiber in her body. She opened her eyes, blinking against the harsh fluorescent light of the aid station. She sat up slowly, her head pounding, and swung her legs over the side of the cot. Her boots were still on. The door opened. A sergeant stood there, his expression unreadable. "Lieutenant Vance," he said, his voice formal. "The colonel wants to see you." Alara frowned, still shrouded in a fog of exhaustion. She stood, steadying herself against the wall, and followed him outside. Her steps were slow and stiff. The yard was packed. 500 Marines stood in perfect formation, their uniforms crisp, their faces impassive. They were utterly silent. The entire operational force of Firebase Chimera. Alara stopped, her breath catching in her throat. What was this? A reprimand? Was Foster going to have her disciplined for breaking protocol? Colonel Alistair Finch, the base commander, a man whose quiet authority could quell a riot, stepped forward. His face was like carved granite, his gray eyes missing nothing. He didn't smile. He looked directly at Alara, his voice ringing out with perfect clarity in the morning air. "Lieutenant Vance," as 500 hands snapped up in a salute. The sound was not a rustle of fabric, but a single, sharp thunderclap that seemed to shake the very ground. It was followed by a unified roar that came from the depths of 500 chests. "Sir, yes, sir." Alara stood frozen, her eyes wide. Tears, hot and unexpected, spilled down her cheeks, tracing clean paths through the grime. Her hands trembled at her sides. She didn't wipe her face. She just stood there, a small, solitary figure absorbing the full, crushing weight of their respect. This was their apology. This was their admission. This was their honor. In the crowd, she saw them. Cade Rollins stood in the back, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the dirt in front of him. Lieutenant Decker's face was pale, and there, in the second row, was Gunnery Sergeant Brock Jensen. He wasn't looking at the ground. He was looking directly at her, his face stripped of all its arrogance, revealing a raw, profound shame. As their eyes met, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a concession, a surrender. The salute held for a long, silent moment before Colonel Finch gave the order to stand down. He walked over to Alara, his expression softening slightly. "You saved a Marine yesterday, Lieutenant," he said, his voice softer now. "You reminded all of us what we're fighting for, and what real strength looks like." Nolan Hayes stepped out from the formation. He was holding her medbag. He walked up to her and held it out. "You dropped this, ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Alara took it, her fingers brushing against the worn canvas. She nodded, her lips pressed into a tight line, and slung it over her shoulder. It felt heavier now, filled with more than just medical supplies. It was filled with the weight of a legend. In the days and weeks that followed, Firebase Chimera was a different place. The story of Alara's climb became its defining narrative. The taunts and jeers were replaced by nods of respect and quiet greetings. Soldiers who had once looked through her now made a point to meet her eye. The consequences for those who had led the chorus of mockery were swift and silent. Cade Rollins was reassigned to a desk job stateside, his abrasive attitude deemed no longer suitable for a combat zone. Lieutenant Decker was formally reprimanded by Colonel Finch for his failure to lead during the ambush. And one afternoon, Brock Jensen appeared at the door of the aid station. He didn't say a word. He simply placed a folded piece of paper on her desk and left. Unfolding it, Alara found a handwritten, deeply personal letter of apology, ending with the words, "You earned the right to be called Chief. I was just too blind to see it." Alara never spoke of what happened on the stairs. She didn't need to. She went back to work, her hands as steady as ever, her presence a quiet but powerful reminder of the truth of her character. She didn't gloat. She didn't demand anything. She had proven her worth not with words, but with 200 steps of blood, sweat, and unbreakable will. A month later, her husband, Captain Julian Vance, a man whose quiet competence was as respected as Jensen's strength had once been, came to visit the aid station. The room fell silent as he walked in, his presence filling the space. He nodded to the other medics and walked to Alara's side. "You're early," she said, her face softening in a way no one else on the base ever saw. He smiled, couldn't wait. As they walked out into the yard together, Private Nolan Hayes watched them from a distance. He was writing a letter to his mother. "You wouldn't believe what I've seen here," he wrote, his pen scratching across the paper. "There's this medic, Lieutenant Vance. Everyone said she was too small, too weak. They were wrong. They were all so wrong." He didn't know it, but a local paper back home would eventually publish an excerpt from that letter. The story would spread, pass from one base to another, evolving from a soldier's tale into a durable military legend. The small medic who carried a bleeding Marine up 200 steps under fire. The woman they had laughed at, who proved them all wrong. Reality has a way of catching up. Sometimes you carry the weight of other people's doubts. Sometimes you climb a staircase no one believes you can. Sometimes you fall, and the world expects you to stay down. But you don't. You get up. You keep going, one step at a time. And when you reach the top, the ones who doubted you will finally see. They'll know that you were never small, and you were never weak. You were, and always had been, more than enough.